Hello, I'm Julia Fisher. Welcome to this week's edition of The Olive Tree and another story from the heart of Israel. My guest today is Uzzi. He's a quietly spoken man in his 60s. I first met him in Tel Aviv, where he was helping a Messianic congregation with their book publishing. Over the next two programs, Uzzi tells his story. A story of how his family escaped from Germany and the Holocaust, of how Uzzi was terribly injured while serving in the Israeli army during one of the many wars that Israel fought after her independence in 1948, and how his life was miraculously restored some years later. I started by asking Uzzi, was he born in Israel?
Yes, I was. I'm a 1950 vintage. It was a good year, 1950.
And were your parents, were they born here or did they come from somewhere else?
No, they came from Europe. My late father came from Germany, the beginning of the 1930s. That's a story on its own, of course. And my mom came from Bulgaria. And they met on a kibbutz in Lower Galilee at the foot of Mount Tabor. 1949, they got married. 1950, I was born. Israel was just 2 years old, and I was born in Lower Galilee. And then my father's name was Joseph. I was born in Galilee, and I'm a believer now.
Did you grow up on a kibbutz?
I did not grow up on the kibbutz. I was just born there, and when I was about 1 year old, my parents decided they had enough of socialistic life, and they moved into Big Apple, Tel Aviv.
What did your father do for work?
He was a journalist.
He escaped from Germany just in time.
Yeah, he arrived in Palestine when he was only 10 years old. My grandfather had the nose to smell what was going to happen there. My late grandmother was a very famous stage director and actress. She thought she was German through and through. She had a big crisis. She didn't understand why my grandfather decided to flee the country, the center of Europe, cultural center of Europe, and come to the sand dunes and camels of Palestine. But when they heard the news started coming about Kristallnacht and so on, she said thank you to my grandfather, and that was the end of it.
Did you lose many of your other family in the Holocaust?
Actually, it's only my family on my paternal grandmother, my grandmother's family.
So it's against that backdrop that you grew up here in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Can I tell you a little bit about my first? When you mention Israel, of course, everybody thinks about wars. If I can tell you one or two anecdotes about my first war experience when I was only 6.5 years old, just started first class in school. I was an only child at the time. My father knew, as a journalist, he was a journalist for the army, civilian journalist, a journalist for the army. And he knew that the first Sinai operation was going to take place. The Egyptians decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. Britain and France, along with Israel, didn't like it because it was a major marine thoroughfare. My father knew that the operation was going to take place. And as we know from history, the Brits and the French pulled out at the last minute, left 8-year-old Israel to do the job, which we did. But my father said to my mom, I feel like going to first session of the cinema. Let's go. Out they went. I was asleep already. And then he said to my mom, wait a second, I forgot something inside. I don't know, in a lightning speed, he just covered all the windows with blankets and so on to darken the place. He put the dining table over my bed. I was unaware of that. And turned all the lights off, and they went to cinema. In the middle of the session, my mom heard the sirens going off. And she said, did you know about that? I said, yes, I did. How did you dare taking me out for cinema, and the child is on his own and the siren is going off and so on? Well, I woke up from that siren, a 6.5-year-old, saw the monstrous dining table, what looked like monstrous dining table, over my head. And of course, that left a little trauma in my life, I would say. That was my first. The second time was 1967, the Six-Day War. I was only 17, so I was called to the army, but I still had to finish my high school. So I wasn't quite a man yet and no longer a boy. And then 1968, I was called and I joined the IDF. And I became a tank driver in the Sinai, and that's what I did till 1973. 1973, I was already a reservist. I loved the Sinai. I was like a desert mouse. In June 1973, I got married for the first time. I'm telling you all of these things because they have relevancy to the rest of the story. I got married, couldn't go for honeymoon to Europe as we wanted, so we waited until September. September we went on honeymoon, belated honeymoon, to Europe, and we came back at the beginning of October with the last El Al flight from Zurich on the 5th of October, 1973. Didn't even manage to unpack my stuff, and the next day I joined the war. Came back from the war after bad injury in the last hour of the war, an injury that maybe saved my life because the guy that replaced me in driving the tank to a gentleman by the name of Ehud Barak was killed half an hour later. And who knows, anyway, that left me paralyzed in both legs. And 17 years to the date after my injury in the Sinai, the Lord touched me and healed me in South Africa.
So you went to South Africa paralyzed and came back healed and walking.
I went to South Africa 17 years later at the age of 40. I was 23 when I was injured. That first marriage didn't hold because of the war. I came back injured not only physically, but emotionally, mentally. For 17 years, I didn't have one good night's rest. I don't know if you've ever seen Amazing Grace, about the abolition of slavery in Britain. If you remember John Newton saying, I have 20,000 ghosts haunting me every night. That's the story of my life for 17 years, because 99% of death in the armored corps is by fire. And there is nothing you can do against it. Just to hear the cries of your mates being burnt alive for a few minutes each time, and there is nothing you can do to go and pull them out. I couldn't even go next to a barbecue. I couldn't bear the smell of burning flesh. And those voices, not to mention the fact that physically each time you want to turn in your bed, you actually have to wake up, hold your legs in your hands and turn around, otherwise you get bed sores. Nevertheless, despite all of that, I managed to pursue a career, study computer science, and so by profession I'm actually an IT man. But at this old ripe age of 61, nobody wants me in my profession, so I'm working for the Lord as a book publisher.
Uzzi sharing the first part of his extraordinary story, and we'll hear more from Uzzi on next week's programme. You're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, where week by week we bring you stories of both Jewish and Arab believers in Jesus living in Israel and the Palestinian areas today, to help us understand what God is doing there at this time against the backdrop of turmoil that's going on in the Arab nations surrounding Israel, not to mention the internal struggles the nation is facing. And the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish and Arab Christians living in the Holy Land, especially those involved in reconciliation. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, P.O. Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. If you'd like to hear this programme again or any edition of The Olive Tree, please visit the website olivetreefund.org. I'll be back at the same time next week for another story from The Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.